So then, a couple days later, I went to see him. And I went up to his apartment, and I walked through. There was this courtyard there, and there was this one devotee, and he was he was typing. He was typing, completely immersed in his work, and I associated that this manuscript he was typing, and it must be something that Swami's books. So I went up to the apartment, knocked on the door, and the door opened, and the Swami was there. And he said, yes. And he said, well, I'd like to speak with you. And he, oh yes, come in. And then we went in together to his little sitting room. Prabhupada sat down behind this little metal box. It looked very quaint. And we started talking. He asked me my name. And I told him Bruce, and Prabhupada was talking about in India during the Raj there was one Lord Bruce, and so on. And then I started telling the Swami about myself, and then I just found myself saying that. Well, I want to become your student, full time. And actually, I had just finished taking. I had taken a special training for teaching, and I was employed by the New York City Board of Education to teach remedial reading. It was a special program to culturally deprived children, means, in the ghettos. And so I said to the Swami that, well, I've just finished my training. Actually, my assignment was beginning the next day. And I said, well, my job actually begins, I have a job, and I'm beginning it tomorrow as my assignment, but I just want to be with you. I just want to be your student. So Prabhupada said, well, that's fine. But you have a job. And I said, yes. Probably kind of lit up. He said, oh, and what is the salary? So then Prabhupada explained to me Bhagavad-gita in a nutshell. And he explained Krishna telling Arjuna to do his duty, to do devotional service, to work for Krishna, but not partake of the fruits of the activity. Give all the fruits of activity to Krishna. So Prabhupada explained to me, and then he gave me a very practical instruction, first instruction. So he said, you can be my student, and you can also do your job, and you can also give the fruits of your job to Krishna. So my first service was to work and to give my salary to Prabhupada.
The first contact I had with Srila Prabhupada, after having heard that he was starting a temple, was that I was about to move into a place I was going to use as a sculpture studio for myself in the Haight-Ashbury on Frederick Street. As a matter of fact, it was in 518 Frederick Street in San Francisco that I had some friends of mine had the place, and they were turning it over to me. And my first contact with Srila Prabhupada in that sense was I was rather shocked to find that somehow he'd gotten it. My studio. Before I could move in, he'd somehow gotten it away, and I was very upset at that time, and I thought, what am I doing? What's going on here? I had this great studio, and now it's gone. And then I thought to myself, my heart softened, and I said, well, he's a yogi, and he's doing good, so I guess that's okay. And so I forgave fate, little realizing what an amazing turnaround was going to take place.
We had an altar before even Lord Jagannath came. So in a non-self-conscious way, in a way that was very open-minded. Prabhupada, Swamiji at the time, didn't tell us about vyasasana, didn't make us cut our hair, didn't say anything about bowing down. And he just accepted things as they are and accepted us. And he could have gone for any segment of society, Vivekananda, whatever, try to speak to large groups. Krishna sent us, enthusiastic, young, believing we could do anything. In some ways it was good because already being adventurous or already not being too staid in the lifestyle, we were able to go along and do anything as an adventure. And that's what happened anyway. We followed him to the ends of the earth. So the totem pole, there was an artist who came from New York. There was a New York contingent that slowly came to San Francisco. And there was Haridas, Harvey Cohn. He came in a Cadillac, an old Cadillac. We called it the Krishna-lac. It was our car. And so he still did his art, and for some reason, he put a totem pole right by the temple altar in Frederick Street. Here's the altar. And there was a painting of the Panchatattva that he eventually put there. And the totem pole was there with hooked noses and wings and masks and moons. And Prabhupada just accepted it. There was eclectic pictures. Lord Jesus was in the temple. Prabhupada said, Lord Jesus is very nice. And so the totem pole was just part of the temple, and he didn't really tell us to do too much, except very directly. Cooking he taught. Cooking he taught Jamuna and Harsharani, Govinda Dasi. I don't know if she told you about the starvation committee, that he called her the starvation. Well, she chose to perhaps leave that out, but when he was sick at one time, she had a special diet that the doctors told to give him, and Prabhupada wanted stuffed portal or something like that, and he called her the starvation committee.
That my mother came to see Prabhupada after, so 'cause I was telling her about it, and she wanted to see what. And then my brother came and joined me also, and she wanted to see what we were getting into. And so she came one evening just before the kirtan, and by that time I had also already been home to visit her, and she saw, we were strict vegetarian. We wouldn't eat the food that she cooked, and the pots were contaminated. She was contaminated. The whole house was contaminated, and so she said, "Hey, what's happening here?" Anyway, so she went to see Prabhupada, and Prabhupada in his room had one folding metal chair, which was meant for VIPs who couldn't sit on the floor. So this chair was put out for her, and she sat on this chair, and everyone else, Prabhupada, us, we sat on the floor. And then she was asking Prabhupada, what are you doing with my boys, and this and that. And Prabhupada was explaining, preaching. And so then at a certain point, Prabhupada asked that, I'm taking care of your sons. By that time I had left my apartment and moved into the storefront. Gargamuni also. I'm taking care of them. I'm feeding them and looking after them and providing. And actually we have no income here and so on. And maybe you would like to give some donation. And my mother looked at us and looked at Prabhupada and said, well, donation, I think I've already given a donation. I've donated my sons. And Prabhupada said, oh, yes, very good. And he said, that's okay. And, but by her saying that, and it was like she gave us to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada accepted.
But the strongest presence I remember when I first met Srila Prabhupada was in Golden Gate Park. It was in 1966 or 66 or 67. I was standing there and everyone was out. Hayagriva was playing trumpet. Somebody had kettle drums. There were gongs and cymbals and incense was burning, and Prabhupada was leading a kirtan in, I guess it was on Hippie Hill or a hollow over there in the Haight-Ashbury, and in Golden Gate Park. And he sat there chanting, and I had developed some sort of psychokinetic powers because of lacking anything better to do with my energy. And I used to be able to play pinballs and move the ball around and do stuff like that, you know. Said one of the things I used to do for pleasure, and it was sort of a interfering demoniac basically sort of pleasure, was looking at people when they weren't looking at me and making them turn around. So I thought I'd try that on Srila Prabhupada. Well, we didn't call him Prabhupada back then. He was called Swamiji, or the Swami. And I thought I'd make Swamiji turn around. And I stared and stared and stared, and nothing happened. And I looked at a bunch of other people that were standing around in the crowd, and they turned around very fast, just as though a bee had landed on their neck, you know. And I just sort of stared at Prabhupada again, and it didn't happen. I began to be very alarmed, and something inside of me became very determined, and I said, I am not going to leave this place until Swamiji, the Swami, turns around and looks at me. I want to know that I've made contact with him. And it ceased to be an issue of this ego control of wanting to make someone turn around, but I just wanted to make contact. And I went on and on. I kept on amping up my energy until I was breaking out in a sweat, and nothing happened. He was simply chanting, and he looked very ethereal, sort of as though he were floating in some sort of cosmic amniotic fluid, you know, and he was his kirtan, and he was moving flexibly and just totally unaffected. Finally, whatever energy in me that wanted him to turn around began to plead and actually beg. And the minute I became very sincerely begging, all of a sudden his eyes floated around to the side, and he looked at me, and it froze me for a moment. His eyes looked as though they were like whale eyes or dolphin eyes, floating in nowhere, some sort of golden light, and they were looking at me, and they hovered there for a moment that seemed like eternity, neither beckoning nor rejecting, just observing. I stood there, and my whole system collapsed from the inside out, and I just stared, and I said, oh my God. And all sorts of confusing emotions ran through me at that time, and I was standing there with a girlfriend, and I wasn't, you know, I was sort of, you know, a hippie-styled person. And outside, I was very confused. Inside, I had an overwhelming thought. I must go and straighten myself out and go to some place where I can really think things through, because I am not ready to become his disciple yet. My first impulse was to become his disciple.
Then Haridas decided to paint the Panchatattva, but for some reason he thought they were women. It was very different then. And so they were in Hawaii or something, and so he painted them with breasts, the Panchatattva. And so when Prabhupada came in and the new painting was unveiled over the new altar, the eclectic altar, Prabhupada he actually said, at Haridas, and said, those are men, not women, and so please change it. So he changed it. So it was really quite open in the beginning, and it's really an amazing thing how Prabhupada was so patient, and he just introduced things very slowly.
When the Swami would walk into the room, into the storefront to give the class, everyone would bow down. I saw others doing it, so I started doing it. This was in the very beginning. But Gargamuni wouldn't. He was the only one. He would just sit there. And this was going on for some time. And but Gargamuni, I think, felt a little self-conscious about it. After class, Prabhupada would always ask for questions. So on one occasion, then Gargamuni, he raised his hand and asked that, the others, when you come into the room, everyone bows down, but I don't bow down, and because I don't feel like bowing down. So if I don't feel like doing it, I'm not going to do it, because then if I did it, it would be artificial. So I want to be more real, and I'm just explaining to you, and if this is all right. So Prabhupada looked at him and said, you should bow down. And by bowing down, then the feeling will come. So this is a very nice instruction. And of course, he started doing that. And it worked.
In the early days, the temples were so used to Prabhupada's personal association, and I might suggest that Prabhupada's association, particularly in the early days, particularly in a small temple, was so galvanizing that when Prabhupada was there, he was like a magnet, and everything else was like iron filings. Everyone knew how to act, everyone knew what to do when Srila Prabhupada was present. All things fell into place. It was very simple to be a devotee. It was very simple to be spiritual. If he said, this is how to cook dal, suddenly you became empowered to cook dal. If he said, this is how you chant, suddenly you were empowered to chant. If he says, get this building, suddenly you got this building. All you had to do was have enough suspension of disbelief to go ahead and do it. And by Prabhupada's direct kinetic personal presence, it happened. So we were so used to that, and then if he told people to work together on something, never mind they were enemies 10 minutes before, they could work perfectly together. It was very much like the lion lying down with the lamb, or Lord Chaitanya going through the Jharikhanda forest. Suddenly everyone spoke the same language, and it was very easy, because he took away the ego barriers that made it impossible to see the higher self, and to see the relationship with Krishna, to see his relationship with Krishna. All in all, people talk about channeling. Prabhupada was continuously channeling Super Soul. Therefore, he was channeling the source of everyone's well-being. Everyone's answer was coming from Prabhupada, because everyone's answer is ultimately coming from Super Soul. So that when you saw Prabhupada, he was like the main branch of the bank. He had it all. He had all the information. So everyone was so used to that when Prabhupada went to another temple, everyone tried and tried and tried to maintain the standard. But being what we were, it gradually would sink down like silt in the stream. And then when Prabhupada came back again, all of a sudden it was all excitement and everything worked again. So in those days, we always managed that Prabhupada would go from temple to temple to temple and keep them all revived.
I would photograph a lot, so sometimes he would tease me and he'd say, why are you photographing me so much? Photograph something important like people chanting. And actually in San Francisco he teased me again. He said I was photographing a lot. I should have had one of those motorized drives or something. But I was just photographing. But it's because his mood changed so purely. So he said, there's a superstition in India that if someone is photographed, it will shorten their life. Or he might have said shorten their longevity. What do you think? And I stopped. I was shocked. I was photographing and he said, shorten your life. He said, what do you think? And he was looking down at me. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well, I think that it's how someone uses their life, not how long it is. And he says, yes, that is just a superstition. And so I said, well,
the initiation was, so Prabhupada asked me that I should invite my mother to come. So I did, and she came. My father wouldn't come, but she came. And again, she sat on the chair, and we had the fire sacrifice, and then, so at the end, of course, when Prabhupada gave the beads, and then, so I bowed down to him, and then Prabhupada said, no, you bow down to your mother. So I turned and I got down and I bowed down, and of course I said the mantra of obeisances to Prabhupada. But my mother, was quite, she felt quite uncomfortable having her son bowing down at her feet. And then Prabhupada instructed me that whenever you see your mother, you bow down to her. You offer obeisances. And I used to do that. Sometimes I would go home and visit them. They lived in Connecticut. Once I went there to distribute books to all our family friends. So I would, ring the doorbell, and my mother would open the door, and there was nobody there, but there I was on the ground offering obeisances. So she didn't like it, of course, but actually it was Prabhupada's instruction, and we did it, and we felt closer to Prabhupada following. And of course the attachment, mother-son family attachment was kind of dissipated by that. It made the relationship more formal. So it was a nice instruction.
At the initiation, he said in our name, but I was afraid at the initiation. I kind of knew that it meant that I'd have to be surrendering. We didn't really know what we were in for. There was no great movement at the time. As I say, there was 12, 14, 16 people around. And Prabhupada was very kind, and we were eating and chanting, and no bowing down, no head shaving. A lot of fun. He was like our father, this great Swami sitting in our midst. People were still coming off LSD trips in the early morning kirtans as part of the whole scene. They'd have all-night trips, and the best place to go to the Krishna temple, chant, even if it was a bummer trip, and they give you breakfast. So people were coming around. And so Prabhupada, at my initiation, there were all sorts of freaks. The temple was smoking like anything because Janaki brought fruit box wood, pulped wood instead of real wood, fruit box. And we had ghee instead of butter, so it like sputtered and smoked all over the place. I'm afraid my old jazz friends are coming into the place I was living and saying, don't get initiated, stay with us. Some Christian shows up saying that this is all, what do they call it, paganism, and I shouldn't do it, and he's arguing with me, and I'm kind of being swayed. And the next day, the day of initiation, actually it started off, Jamuna had actually asked me to marry her in Golden Gate Park, and we weren't sure who. We had a number of people who could have married us, but we said we would really like the Swami to do it. So we asked him, would you marry us? And he said, first you must become initiated. So I said, when do you want us to become initiated? And he said, tomorrow. Another one of those reading the mind things, because I knew that inside and viscerally, intrinsically, I knew that it meant surrender. So the tomorrow came, and I had still been hanging out with my other friends, and they were in the temple, and I was calling, I'm coming, and then I'd say, I don't want to do it, and it was like up to the time. They weren't sure if I was going to show. So finally I show. Jamuna's there. We're stringing the beads up to the time, getting fruit box wood, getting ghee for the, instead of, made out of margarine. And 4 of us were getting initiated. Shamadasi. Then there was another woman who had a child. Was that at the wedding? No, I think it was at the initiation. There was a child, and the woman was a really space cadet. She was one of the people, I think, who wanted to marry Prabhupada. And the child's head kept on hitting the floor, bonk, bonk. During the initiation, Prabhupada said his name would be Kaviraj, and he said, "Will be strong baby," because he saw his, and he said to the mother, "Lift him up." So he gives me an R name, and then he says, "No, you will be Gurudas," which was great because I was so frightened at the time that I didn't hear my name anyway. Plus I was photographing it all. I was the Iskcon photographer. And people were on all sorts of psychotropics in the fires there and at our wedding, and at our initiation. So then I say to Prabhupada, "When would you like us to get married?" And he said, "Tomorrow." So it's the same thing. He didn't want to give me time to think too much.
When I did join, I joined just a matter of weeks before Srila Prabhupada arrived. So I'd been doing work, fixing up the temple, fixing up Sankirtan vans, and doing all sorts of work. And when Srila Prabhupada was due to arrive, they rented an apartment for him on Ashbury Street, I believe. And they told me, "Quick, Nara-Narayan, you have to do something and build an altar for Srila Prabhupada." So I actually went and I took pieces of wood and turned turnings, and I made an altar for Srila Prabhupada. Very simple, but altar, decorated it. So when Srila Prabhupada came, there was an altar, and he asked, "Who has made this altar?" And they said, "Nara Narayan." He said, "Oh, bring him here." Actually, I wasn't named Nara Narayan. I wasn't initiated. He's Nathan Baruch. So I came, and he approved. Actually, but before that time, I'd written a letter to Srila Prabhupada, and he had responded to me with my Karmi name. Before he actually came to Los Angeles, I wrote and said I wanted to serve Krishna in every way possible. And he wrote back and said, "My dear Nathan Baruch, this is a very rare manifestation. I think you were a devotee in your previous life. To begin your service wanting to serve Krishna in every way possible means you have done devotional service before." He said, "So please continue to do that, chant your rounds, do these services, carve deities." And he gave me actually these blessings through his very first letter, which was a letter which in itself was enough to keep me going for a lifetime.
The first bloop is a good story. There's somebody named Rabindas Farouk. Sensitive, poetic-looking, ascetic-looking type of person. Very thoughtful, obviously loved Prabhupada. Came from New York in about the second or third wave. Prabhupada recognized him from New York, and he didn't say too much. He was a very sensitive person, and sometimes things came out honestly and abruptly. He said what he thought, and Prabhupada loved him very much. Now there was a vyasasana. Finally there was a vyasasana, and Prabhupada was sitting up on it. It wasn't that high, but it was above the floor, maybe as high as that desk, this high. And in the middle of the kirtan, Rabindas Swarup called out and said, I've got to reach God directly. I cannot do it through anybody else." This was his conflict. He didn't want to do it with any priest, any intermediary. Now, Prabhupada heard him say that, and Rabindas Swarup started crying. It was such an important thing to him. It was such an important conflict. He loved Prabhupada, but he wanted to do it. He says, I've got to do it on my own. This was his conflict. And so Prabhupada said, "Come here, my boy." And Rabindranath Swarup came right up on the vyasasana and put his head there right in Prabhupada's lap. And Prabhupada said, "Dear, dear my boy, I just want you to be happy. I just want you to be happy." And he was looking up into Prabhupada's face and crying. And Prabhupada was looking down, very compassionate, and just said, "I just want you to be happy." And then Ravindra Swarup bolted up off the vyasasana and bolted out of the front doors. It was all one room. It wasn't anybody sneaking out in the middle of the night. And it was actually like a play, because we were all there and we saw him run out. And we were shaken by it, all of us, because we were a family. We were a family then, and that's the way it always has been in most of my Krishna consciousness, even after some time pioneering whatever, because there are small temples with a few people and we're building together. So we were not that many people, and we were his wife, I don't know if they are officially married, his girlfriend, Haladar, was there. She didn't know whether she would ever see him again. He just left. We saw him fleeting from the front of the temple after he slammed the door. Prabhupada said, "Now let us chant." And he led with the sizzling kartals, played them so nicely, or the bongos in those days. Didn't say anything after that. We chanted, we were crying. Somebody else might have heard something. I don't remember him saying anything about it.
Then at a certain point, Prabhupada got the stroke. That was Memorial Day weekend in '67. And anyway, after that whole affair, Prabhupada couldn't type. He was actually partially paralyzed on one side. Anyway, there was no question of how was Prabhupada going to write his books. So we had to talk all about this. It was a big thing, what to do, so on. Longhand, that would be so difficult. Anyway, Gargamuni had seen, they were just starting to come out with these dictaphones, office dictaphones, and he had seen one in a store window. And he had gone in and asked about it. And he went to Prabhupada and asked Prabhupada, I just saw one. And Gargamuni had some money, he was doing already his business. And so Prabhupada said, "Yes, that is good, bring that." So he bought it and had the man show him how to operate it and so on. And so he brought, it was his Grundig, German. And so he brought the machine in, and so Gargamuni unpacked it and was going to show Prabhupada how to operate it. I mean, it took Gargamuni like an hour just to learn how to operate it. Prabhupada said, no, that's all right, you just leave it here, I will see to it. And he did that, and Prabhupada was able to operate it without showing him how to do it or anything. Interesting. And so then Prabhupada was making these tapes. So Prabhupada's dictating all these tapes, so we had to transcribe the tapes. That was something. I mean, everyone took a try at it. It was very tedious work, and to go back and forth, and the typing, and we all found it quite kind of tedious to do. And we weren't making so much progress on the transcribing. Prabhupada was becoming more and more, doing more and more of the tapes. So then this became another problem. Hayagriva was the best typist, but then he was going to teach in the university and so on. So it became, that was a problem. So then one day, this boy walks in the storefront. His name was Neil. And he was from Antioch College. In Antioch College, they have a program where you can work at a job and get college credit for that job if it has something to do with your study. I don't know what his study was, something in sociology. So he just came to New York and wanted to work for some organization for a semester. And so he picked the Hare Krishna. And I mean, he just kind of walked in. He didn't even know what we were doing or anything. And anyway, I asked him, well, what can you do? He said he wanted to do some. I said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm a typist and I'm a transcriber. I said, okay. It was like the answer to the prayers. There was all these kinds of little miracles. These are like little miracles. Everything with Prabhupada was always these little miracles, one after the other. And we didn't even have a table for him to use. We like made some cartons, some fruit cartons, and put a piece of wood there, and put the dictaphone there in the corner of the apartment, and boy, he just raced through those tapes. And it was such a nice, Prabhupada was just making more and more tapes, and he's just racing through transcribing. We had the editing. And well, he finished Bhagavad-gita, he did Nectar Devotion, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, some other things, Ishapanishad and so on. And of course then when his semester ended, then he left. Never saw him again. But he had done so much. And it was just what was required.
The first alone experience I had with Srila Prabhupada was in Seattle. At the time after I finished decorating that temple, he came up. It was a glorious success. And we found a horrible, they'd found a bad place for him. He didn't like it. And Jayananda and Govinda Dasi and I went out in the middle of the night, in the middle of a fog, and were driving wildly around chanting and praying for a place for Prabhupada. We were driving up, I think, on Capitol Hill, and all of a sudden, in this dense fog, where we could not even see the road, a sign emerged that said, "For rent." And we said, that's what we were chanting, that's what happened. And so not one of us looked like the sort of person you'd rent to, because we all had shaved heads, and Govinda Dasi was wearing so here Jayananda, who always looks pretty much like a ordinary, Joe, he got out of the truck with without his short hair and wearing his karmi clothes, went and rented the place. It was gorgeous. When we finally saw what it was like in the morning, it was a garden apartment with like windows, and when you looked out, you were looking into the flower beds, because most of the room was under the ground, and it was half a way out of the ground, so you could actually see beautiful lawns and flowers and stuff. And Prabhupada loved it. So in that room, Harsharani and Govinda Dasi were his servants, and he was living there, and I happened to come over for some reason or another, and we were all sitting in Prabhupada's room. Oh yes, Srila Prabhupada was talking to me about the possibility of going to New Vrindavan and building dioramas. He wanted to start a museum, fate museum type thing in New Vrindavan at that time. So he and I and another devotee were there, and then somehow or other, and I'm never quite sure how it happened, he and I ended up alone in the room. And it was Srila Prabhupada's room. He always had a coffee table, which he used as a desk, because he liked to sit on the floor. And he had an armoire next to it, a steel cabinet, such as he used to have in India, and in it he used to keep his correspondence and books and things like that. And Srila Prabhupada was behind the desk, and he was showing me, incidentally to doing something else, how he would open up an envelope with a letter opener and then use the envelope for his reply, and then to save paper and for his first draft. And then he'd draft it out again onto the letter when he had it down the way he wanted it. And somehow he had asked me to do something, and in the end, I ended up behind his desk, and he ended up on the other side. I was so on my toes and alarmed by the experience of being alone with Prabhupada. It was just like being with Queen Elizabeth or Indra or something of that sort, all alone. And you say, oh my God, what am I going to do now? I have no instruction. I don't even know what to say, because I wasn't just initiated. And I had, been a part of the Hridashri. I was still sort of psychedelicizing a little bit. And Srila Prabhupada was standing there, and I'm sitting there totally mortified, wringing my hands and squirming my toes and wondering what to do next, and not wanting to leave by any means, but not knowing what to do if I stayed. And Srila Prabhupada looked at me and said, we should always be considering what is my duty, he said. And I'm thinking, duty, okay. And I was been hearing impaired since I was young, and I didn't know that. And it's only the last few years I got hearing aids. So I didn't have any hearing aids. So what to speak of Prabhupada's accent and my inability to hear, I was having a hard time understanding, plus the psychedelics residually floating around in my brain cells. So Prabhupada points at this coffee table and says, do you see this ant? And I've been looking very carefully, and I know Srila Prabhupada is the external representative of Super Soul, that when Prabhupada says there's an ant, there's an ant. And I looked at the table, and there was no ant there. And he said, do you see that ant? And I didn't know what he meant. I said, there's no ant. And I said, sort of like yes and no combined. Because I didn't want to say no and appear stupid to not see the spiritual or whatever ant was there. And I didn't want to say yes and be proven a liar, because I couldn't see the ant and I didn't know where it would be found. So then Srila Prabhupada looked at me intensely, as though that the ant issue now being solved, he wanted to get on to real business, and he said, my duty, he said, is to, my job, he said, is to understand what is my duty to this ant. I said, oh no. I said, not only there's an ant that I can't see, but now I have a duty to it. I said, what am I going to do? He said, somehow, Prabhupada looked at me beseechingly almost, somehow I have to help this ant. He said, and maybe I can chant. And he said, reaches down, he says, maybe I can chant Hare Krishna. Or he went like this, feed it a little prasadam. He said, if we can help one ant become Krishna conscious, then our whole movement is a glorious success. And then I realized it was a pure metaphor. That Prabhupada was aware of my bewilderment is pretty obvious. That he used it to make a point was excellent. And there I was, instructed by the invisible ant to whom I had a duty to feed and to chant, and that if I did so, it was our movement, whole movement was a success.
Saraswati, myself, and Jamuna got the whole crowd chanting. And it was, we were quite successful, but he saw Saraswati. We were there, but he saw Saraswati, and he liked that she was getting everybody to chant. So, later on, he gave her a deity. Did you know that? He gave her a deity, and for her to worship, very young, 3, 4 years old, 5, not quite sure. And one day they were playing almost like transcendental dolls. The deities were there. Saraswati had become quite attached to the deities. Prabhupada took the deity and hid it behind his back. Saraswati was looking, where's my Krishna? Prabhupada said, where's Krishna? Where's your Krishna? Like that. And she became very upset. And she was crying. Where's my Krishna? He let her cry. She said, do you have him? Where is he? And he played no. And then she cried very much. She was really crying a lot. And then he said, I have him. Here he is. I just wanted to see how you would feel the separation. for your Krishna.
So then it came to publish Bhagavad-gita. Prabhupada was so determined to publish it, but there was no money to print it ourselves. And anyway, Allen Ginsberg, who was a friend, although he wasn't a Vaishnava, wasn't a devotee, I mean, he had his own lifestyle, but he was very sympathetic. He had been to India. He liked chanting. Prabhupada instructed him, chant Hare Krishna before you do any poetry reading, and he used to do that. And he gave Prabhupada first harmonium, which he had brought from India, and he would give donations. And with the immigration thing, he was helping. And anyway, when the manuscript was ready for printing, we gave it to Alan, and he was very enthusiastic. He sent it to his publishers, but they rejected it. And then he sent it to some other publishers he knew. Again, everyone rejected it. And after about 6 months of trying it, and he just lost interest. Everyone was rejecting it. So then Prabhupada gave the manuscript to Ray Rama, who was the editor of the Back to Godhead. And so he tried, and he was sending it around to academic publishers, and again, everyone rejected. You know, you get the little letter in the mail, thank you very much, however, this doesn't fit into our plans, you know, this and that and everything. So then after about 6 months, then he gave up. So then Prabhupada gave it to me to do. Anyway, by that time, I had absolutely no faith that this was, because I could see that there was no commercial value to this manuscript. I mean, every page there was Krishna consciousness, Krishna consciousness. And I was thinking, well, if you're not Krishna conscious and you're not interested in Krishna consciousness, you're not going to be interested in this commentary. There's no fancy poetry or scholarly, the footnotes and academics, and I had read different Bhagavad-gitas, and no esoteric things, and so I just had no faith, and I didn't know what to do, and I was going to bookstores and trying to see how they were doing, and then to learn how to get a book published, and I was going to the library and reading and trying to find out how to do this, but I didn't know what to do. So in the meantime, Prabhupada had recorded the record, the Hare Krishna record, which eventually the Beatles got, and that interested them when they heard that record. And the record was there was a lot of interest. It was very nice. One radio station played it all night long. For 10 hours they played the record over and over again. The WBAI, one of these alternative radio stations. So we were advertising the record in different kind of underground publications. An order came for the record one day. I used to get the mail and then bring it up to Prabhupada, and we'd go over it together. And he would dictate and I would take notes and answer letters and so on. So one order came for a record, and it was the letter was from the Macmillan Company, big publisher worldwide. So and it was on this letterhead, Macmillan letterhead, so-and-so was ordering a record album with a check, and I rushed up to Prabhupada. I said, Prabhupada, look, someone is from Macmillan Company. I mean, I didn't know what to do. We were, helpless. Prabhupada had to tell us everything. So Prabhupada said, he thought for a while, and then he said, you bring the record tomorrow, you bring it to the person, personally, and you tell that you have a Bhagavad-gita that you want to publish. And I said, well, okay, I don't know, should I bring the manuscript? No, you just tell them. And I said, well, okay, but I have to say something about you as the author. Maybe I should bring some of the other books you've published, like from India, the books you have already published, Srimad Bhagavatam. He said, no, just tell them that you have a Bhagavad Gita to publish. I said, okay. So the next day I went uptown, I got dressed up in shirt and tie and went uptown to, they have a skyscraper, Macmillan Company, and the person who I was giving the record to was an accountant. It had nothing to do with really publishing. He was just adding numbers, and I'm sitting there and I'm trying to think, well, how am I going to tell him? What am I going to tell him? So anyway, we're talking something about the record and the mantra and so on, and I'm kind of sitting there bewildered, and then the door opens and in walks someone, and he all of a sudden, very formally, he says, well, I'd like to introduce you to, and this is James Wade, he's our senior editor, and this is me. So, and I just shook hands with Mr. Wade, and I just looked him right in the face. I said, I have a Bhagavad Gita to publish. He said, a Bhagavad Gita by a Swami, an Indian Swami, here in New York? He did this himself? I said, yes. He said, complete the entire Bhagavad Gita? I said, yes. And he said, well, that's exactly what I'm looking for to fill out our religion section. I got Buddhas, and we have the Quran. We have everything. We don't have a Bhagavad Gita. I need a Bhagavad Gita. Can you want us to publish? Well, we'll publish it. We'll publish it. And I couldn't believe what was happening. He actually agreed to publish it. He didn't even see the manuscript. Everyone else had rejected it for whatever reason, and here he is accepting it without even seeing it. I mean, I couldn't even believe it. I just flew back down to Prabhupada and told him the news. I was so excited, and Prabhupada it was like he was expecting it. Prabhupada just nodded.
We were in Columbus, Ohio, at that incredible time when Prabhupada led a kirtan at, I think it was University of Ohio or Columbus State or whatever it was, and everybody was so ecstatic they began dancing, but there was no place to dance because it was an auditorium, so they all stood up and were dancing on the handles of the on the armrests of the theater seats. Not devotees, everybody, thousands of students were there. And it all came about, they came there for Prabhupada and they came for Allen Ginsberg, and Prabhupada and Ginsberg did a joint program. And during that program it was sort of interesting because they didn't find a thing for holding the microphone. There was supposed to be a wire that went around the neck and held the microphone. They couldn't find one. And Allen Ginsberg went to Srila Prabhupada and said, oh, Swamiji, I will give you my shoelace. And Prabhupada was very offended. He did not want to take Allen Ginsberg's shoelace to hold a microphone. And Srila Prabhupada looked at Allen Ginsberg as though he were like 3 inches tall and not made of a very pleasant substance. And Len looked at me and said, Nara Narayan, Vishwakarma, you must give me, sacrifice your sacred thread. Now, he had told me never to take off the sacred thread and showed me how to wear it and to put one on and without taking it off. So he was giving me a direct instruction to take off my sacred thread. I felt exalted, like Joan of Arc being asked to be burned at the stake. I said, sure. So I took off my sacred thread and handed it to Srila Prabhupada and said, thank you. Then he looked at a black look at Allen Ginsberg and put on the sacred thread with a microphone. Well, anyhow, the whole thing went fabulously, and Allen Ginsberg chanted, and Prabhupada chanted, and the thing was wild. It was just incredible. It was very exciting, and it gave a great boost to the beginning of the Columbus Temple. But after and before that time, Allen Ginsberg had flown in just for that purpose, and we had picked him up, and he was staying, I don't know if he was staying at the temple or not. I think he was staying in a hotel, but I don't know, maybe not. He might have been staying at the temple. But anyhow, I was designated to wash Allen Ginsberg's clothes at the laundromat. But he and Prabhupada were carrying on these great dialogues in a small room at the Columbus Temple. And there was room for a certain number of devotees there, and then there was not room for the rest. And sometimes I was in the room and sometimes I wasn't. But a bunch of us found out a way of monitoring the situation. In the next room over, there was a closet. And that closet communicated directly. So we drilled a hole through the wall in the closet. So there'd be like a dozen of us peering through a wall, a closet wall, at what was going on in the next room, trying not to cough or sneeze and revealing our whereabouts. So it was during one of those sessions that I heard Srila Prabhupada talking to Allen Ginsberg, and Ginsberg was talking about the nature of Kali Yuga. And Ginsberg was talking and saying, well, Swamiji, he used to call him Swamiji because that's the way he'd call in the New York. And you know, Prabhupada and Ginsberg go way, way, way back. Ginsberg got him his first harmonium and arranged to help him get his temple. All these things he had aided. He was excited about Krishna consciousness. Although he never became a devotee, he was very enthusiastic about chanting the Hare Krishna mantra and used to hold kirtan all over the place on his own. So here we are peering through that hole in the wall of the closet in the Columbus Temple, and Ginsberg is there saying, well, he said, in Kali Yuga is going on, and Prabhupada was describing how bad Kali Yuga was going to get, how there would cease to be any foliage at all. There would all be carnivorous animals, and people would also be cannibals, that the fruits would be there, but the seed would be big, and the fruit would be just like a skin. There would be nothing to eat. And the devotees would be, what few there were, would be living in caves. He was describing the end times, Krishna conscious version of the end times. And Allen Ginsberg was saying, he said, and your disciples, they will be in the caves? And Srila Prabhupada looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. He said, my disciples, he said, will have gone back to Godhead by then. And Ginsberg was very impressed. He said, oh, really? He said, oh, yes. He said, they are very advanced. They were going to go back very shortly. They're chanting. They're taking part in this process. They're becoming pure devotees in this lifetime. They're going back to Godhead. And Ginsberg said, yes. And they said, what will happen to the rest of us? He said, Prabhupada leaned over to Ginsberg, and Ginsberg leaned over to Prabhupada, and they looked at each other face to face. And Ginsberg was straining to hear what Prabhupada was going to say, and Prabhupada said, Alan, in the end, I will eat you, and you will eat me. That is the end of Kali Yuga. Otherwise, you must go back to Godhead.
Prabhupada has a very fast wit. When people were talking in the beginning about him coming here with his immigration, Nandarani and Dayananda were thinking of sponsoring him. So he said, oh, you can adopt me, but they will say, what will you do with such an old child? And then Allen Ginsberg offered a woman to marry him. And he said, no, I cannot do that. So I saw his wit, and the people would say, oh, Swamiji, you look so nice today. And he says, just today? He would be like that, fast wit. And the early time, there was more than one woman that asked him to marry him, not for immigration, but There's one person that followed him up to Montreal. We were, it wasn't like people were getting kicked out of the temple too much for anything. You had to really do a lot to get kicked out of the temple. We were, in the first days, we were having a rousing hour-and-a-half kirtan and then going out and having a cigarette after it, like it was the theater or something, intermission, with the dogs there tied up in front of the temple because dogs wouldn't be allowed in the temple.
You know, when Prabhupada got his stroke, it was Memorial Day weekend, and Memorial Day weekend in New York, everyone leaves New York City. It's like this huge exodus. And I could see Prabhupada couldn't function, I mean, it was serious. So I called my family doctor, but he was out of town. And, you know, you just get the answering service. I asked other devotees, anyone know any doctor? And nobody knew. And I was calling. I just took the phone book. I started making random calls. Whomever I called, everyone was out of town for the weekend. Everybody goes. At least in those days, I don't know now. And I mean, I'm just calling, and it's hard enough to get anyone to come to a residence anyway. And I actually could not get any doctor. And, you know, it was either bringing Prabhupada to a hospital, I didn't want to do that, and ultimately I just got some kind of doctor's referral service, municipal thing. And eventually I was able to get through them some doctor. And finally a doctor came. And he was this little old, I guess maybe Jewish guy. And he comes in. Of course, we didn't ask him to take his shoes off. But I mean, there we're all standing in our we used to wear these jeans and T-shirts and barefoot. And, you know, and he walks in, you know, there's no furniture, and just a carpet, and there's this old Indian man. You know, he couldn't figure what's going on here. And there's Prabhupada very sick, and everyone's walking on Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. You know, I mean, yeah, he just couldn't understand. So it took him a time just to understand what's going on here, and then what to speak of examining Prabhupada. And he was a very kind of boisterous type of person, and so he examines Prabhupada, and then, you know, with the stethoscope, this, that. And afterwards he goes outside, and so we asked him, so what's wrong? He said, well, I think the old man, he prays too much. So, well, oh yeah, okay. So, he's just praying there. He's just sitting there praying all day, and he's got to get out. He's got to do some exercise. And Prabhupada could hear him from, you know, the other room. Yep, he's got to do something. He's got to exercise. Go for a walk. Got to do something. Go out in the morning. Take a walk. Go to the park. So, anyway, and then he just left. And I mean, this guy, that's all he could do, say. So eventually we did have to I did put Prabhupada in the hospital. And then was a whole thing. And then Prabhupada came out of the hospital. Then we took him to a house in New Jersey we had rented by the seashore. Anyway, then Prabhupada did recover sufficiently, and then Prabhupada announced that now I will take a morning walk. He said that doctor, he said something very good, very valuable. We all laughed because we thought the guy was a nut. And he said, Prabhupada said, no, he has given very good instruction. I will take that up. And Prabhupada then proceeded to take a morning walk, and Prabhupada always took that morning walk. I mean, no matter what his condition, what his health was, whatever. I mean, I know stories of Prabhupada when Prabhupada was in Switzerland and it was snowing out. He was in a hotel. Shamsundar took him to St. Moritz. That's the whole story. But Prabhupada couldn't go outside for his morning walk, so he took his morning walk in the corridors of the hotel, walking, just as if he was outside. He was just walking and walking. I mean, I know when there was an automobile accident we had in Mauritius, and we were all had been injured, even Prabhupada. The next morning, Prabhupada rang his bell. We were all aching and paining, and Prabhupada, he was injured even more, and on his leg and so on. He rang his bell. Where are you going? Morning walk. And we were like hobbling, and but Prabhupada went on his morning walk. And Prabhupada was also he was much older than we were. Because you feel when there was a big tension like that, you feel the next day all that adrenaline. It gives you a lot of pain. So but Prabhupada went on his morning walk. So Prabhupada followed that instruction.
It was a call-in talk show. The man had a reputation of not being so kind to guests. His name might have been Ron Owen, but that could have been the TV program. I arranged it. We went down there, myself, Jayananda, Mukunda, maybe Hayagriva. Since it was a call-in program, Gargamuni suggested, why don't we call in some questions? So we got the number, we poised at the phone, live talk show. Welcome Swamiji, welcome to the United States. A brief introduction. One of us gave a brief introduction about the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, very brief. Call-in questions. First one, Gargamuni. What is the meaning of life, Swamiji? So Prabhupada says, the meaning of life is to be servant of God. So that took about 20 minutes, and this is like a call-in program. They want like sound bites and all this kind of stuff, although they didn't have the term soundbite then. But so then the next question is, why are we on the Earth planet? So Prabhupada again, a long answer. So now the man says, we want questions from somebody else besides your group. So they were obviously being screened by somebody in the engineering room, and the third question was a tremendous question, like, why are we here? What is our purpose for being here? Again, a great question. Prabhupada takes 15, 20 minutes. So now, for juxtaposition, for variety, the guy wants to get another point of view. So this woman from, sounds like a Midwest twang, calls in and says, Swamiji, why is your temple in the Haight-Ashbury? And Prabhupada says, the rents are inexpensive. So she says, why are you teaching hippies? And that might have been when Prabhupada said, they are not hippies, they're happies. It might have been at that time. She said, now how did you get here from India? And he said, I have received a free passage from my friend Sumati Moorji on the Scindia line. So she said, who paid for it? And he said, well, free passage means there's no payment. So she was getting frustrated, and you could hear her. So she said, are you a freeloader? Prabhupada had never heard the word before, but he just said, yes. And we could hear her like fall down on her Formica kitchen floor. It sounded like she fainted, and the guy says, well, I don't like her questions anymore. I'm going to punch her out. So then he started asking questions about, like, what's that mark on your forehead and those kind of things, and then the program ended. But that was one program.
When I was making the Kartamashad murtis, casting them, and Govinda Dasi was painting them in 1969, I made 18 of them because that's how many temples we had at the time. And I said, well, Srila Prabhupada, my task is over. I've made as many deities as there are temples. I guess that's it. And Srila Prabhupada said, no, you must continue. I couldn't continue because the mold went out, and I couldn't make another casting. But I said, really? Well, who will we sell them to? I said, we won't. I said, if we sold them to karmis, they might put them out on their lawn as some sort of lawn furniture, lawn ornaments like flamingos or whatever. And Srila Prabhupada said, if one karmi buys one murti and puts it on his lawn, our whole movement will be a glorious success. And I thought, wow, that's a lot different than the general gist of what we've been pursuing. The idea that any contact with Krishna is a good contact with Krishna. And it was from that point on that he encouraged cottage industries and was saying that cottage industry is the way the people should do, because you keep your family together in the house instead of going everywhere. And he was very much against that. He was always talking about the commuter trains. They are going so fast that way simply so that later they can go so fast the other direction. And that the train only enables people to live so far away that they never see their family. People are meant to live in the same house with their family and work there. Not everybody works together. He said the grandmother works, the son works, the child works, the wife works. They all make something, like the paintings in Puri or Rajasthan. It's a group effort. And it's all done by people that know how to do one part. And they make these products and they sell it, and they stay together as a family and spend the rest of their time God conscious.
He had told me, at one time I was in Vrindavan, Achyutananda came. I don't know if this is appropriate for this, but he had gone to Prabhupada, and I was there, and he said, Gurudas should wear yellow robes. And we both looked at him, why? And Prabhupada said, Achyutananda said, because he is a householder, but he preaches like a sannyasi, and so he can wear yellow robes. And Prabhupada looked at him like, and I didn't care, and so that was shot down. So Achyutananda went on that, well, Gurudas is in Vrindavan, but it would be really good if he could come preaching around India. There's many places. And I had done that somewhat. And I said to Prabhupada after Achyutananda had gone, I don't care if I ever leave Vrindavan. I'm very happy here. I'd like to preach too. What should I do? He said, preach to devotees. He said, they need preaching. There's that same phenomena. Somebody joins, the courtship is over, and now you treat them like a married person, or whatever the analogy is. You grow complacent, that they're not unique and special. So I took that to heart, and I started preaching more. I think I was in charge of Vrindavan at the time, so I made it my business. It was great. Everybody appreciated it. I remembered in London when people came back from Sankirtan that Jamuna would make milk and I would tell them stories or read Krishna book. And everybody remembers that. They said it was like you're a father and she was mother. And Prabhupada again supported that by saying, men and women are in this very place. There's just on one floor difference and there's no mixing. That is because this is a family. It is not artificial here. You are like father and Jamuna is like mother. He said it is not artificial. So it's that family type of thing. And so I was preaching to devotees, and when I was to become sannyas, I pointed out that I thought that preaching to devotees would be diminished because of that. Not only because people treat you differently, and they did, but also a lot of married couples were coming for counseling. And that's my profession now. I'm a counselor, and even then, we were a good example. And so I was preaching to devotees. And so one of my first objections was that that would lessen that. And Prabhupada said, yes, that is so, but then you can preach more widely to the world, which is one of the ideas of becoming sannyasi.
So another interesting example of room conversation was later on in London in 1970. I'm sure there were many rooms in between and private conversations, but this one comes to mind. I had become, as a brahmachari, I was actually a householder, but living like a brahmachari, and living like that and chanting, you begin to wonder, am I going to get anywhere? I mean, certainly Prabhupada is proof positive that Krishna consciousness is not a fantasy, but a practical, normal condition of existence. I won't say human existence, but normal people are devotees. And there are more of them than there are us. We're weird trogdolites or something living somewhere else. But the real people are devotees, and they're happy, normal people that are perfectly fixed in the Atma-Rama state of pure, unalloyed love of God. That's normal life. But what about me? Will I ever get there? So I was chanting my japa in the London temple, which was very small and very tall on Bury Place. And I just finished redecorating the whole place and fixing it up. And I was pacing back and forth in front of Srila Prabhupada's room, and I knew he was inside chanting japa. And I became overwhelmed by the urge to knock on the door and ask Prabhupada, am I going to make some progress? So I knocked on the door and regretted it immediately afterwards. I sat there going in front of the door, worrying that Srila Prabhupada might answer or that he heard. And sure enough, he said, yes, come in. So I opened the door with trepidation, and I was even twice as scared as the first time I described. I came creeping into his room, and there he was, pacing up and down in this wonderful atmosphere that he'd created for himself with his japa bag in his hand. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. He was a Leo, so he was just charging along, saying, Hare Krishna. And I came in saying, oh no, I'm here, I've got to ask the question. So I shut the door behind me and crouched in a corner like a mouse. And Prabhupada looked at me and said, yes. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, I'm chanting, I'm following the program, etc. I said, I keep wondering, is it possible that I could ever become a pure devotee? I mean, I see that you're a pure devotee. Could I ever become a pure devotee? I mean, I'm doing these things, but could I become a pure devotee? And Srila Prabhupada looks at me appraisingly and marches back and forth the room a few times. And every time he turns, he mutters to himself, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And every time he turns around, he whirls around with his bead bag in the lead and says, Hare Krishna, and he charges across the room again. So he does that several times, and I'm getting more and more nervous because I'm beginning to wonder about the answer. And then he looks at me and says, why not? He says, you're in the process. I'm sitting there just melting like into a puddle of ghee. I'm so happy. He chants a few times, and he comes to a corner, he goes, Hare Krishna. He comes around the room, and he looks at me with a gimlet eye and says, but it may take some time.
We're walking, just myself and Prabhupada. I had begun to go to the India Office Library. It was a great library in London. And also the British Museum. I had a pass to the British Museum Library. They had some old Gadyamat books, the British Museum, but India Office Library had everything. They had Bhakti Siddhanta. They had the poem that Prabhupada wrote to Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati in 1934 or 36, Adori Dori, the Holy Day. I had found that in his handwriting and sent it to him, and he was so happy. So I was going through the library, and I had begun to read Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writings a lot, Puryat, etc., and I really liked it because of the poetry and the imagery. It was very flowery, talk about compassionate. And in my heart, I liked Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writings the best. I liked Prabhupada the best, but Prabhupada had a formal side to me and a public persona. When he was lecturing, he was apparently more stern. Not always. As far as the writing, it's very nice, but sometimes I found it to be sometimes repetitious. So in my heart, and I'm not reading this as blasphemy, I'm just being honest as a person, I like Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writings the most. So I lied on the walk. I said I like Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is my second favorite author. Prabhupada looks over at me and says, second? Again, at least I read that he read my mind. So I said, actually, he's my favorite. He said, yes. He said, if I was 1/10 the, and he sobbed, and I don't know the word, if I was 1/10 the of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, I would be a great devotee.
Yeah, you see, all these different things, the different aspects of the movement, Prabhupada didn't specifically, order them, but he kind of he guided us, but we had to find them out for ourselves, and it had to come from our enthusiasm and our realizations. He never made any demands. I mean, even everything, to begin with, like even initiations, he didn't say, all right, now I'm going to initiate you. No, we had to come to Prabhupada and ask, would you initiate us? He never said, now you wash my clothes. We had to come to Prabhupada, can I wash your clothes? So that's the way it was done. Can I learn how to cook prasadam? To make dal, and like that. So even like the Harinam, we would always. Even when Prabhupada was there, Prabhupada led every kirtan. He would play the drum, he would say the prayers, he would lead the kirtan. But nobody even dreamed of singing a kirtan himself. Prabhupada did it. The Swami did it. You see? So when Prabhupada left to go to India, to Vrindavan after his stroke, then we had to do ourselves. As a matter of fact, when Prabhupada left to go to San Francisco, he left to go and do the mantra rock dance Mukunda arranged, and in New York, all of a sudden, who's going to give the lecture? Prabhupada gave every lecture. Who's going to play the drum? And we were just standing around not knowing what to do. All right, why don't you try? Okay, and like this, and okay, I'll give the Raymond said he'll give the lecture, and this, that. And so we just started doing and then I wrote a letter to Prabhupada that we don't know, we miss you, and anyway, Prabhupada wrote back, oh, it's very nice that you are missing me, and if you like, he said, you can put my photograph on my sitting place. So, in Prabhupada's apartment where he would sit. So, we didn't even have a photograph. Nobody had a camera. We didn't even wear watches. That was, that's what we were coming from. It was things. We didn't want things. So, I'd had asked devotees in San Francisco to take a photograph of Prabhupada and send it to us. And then we had it blown up and framed, and we put it at Prabhupada's desk. So with the street chanting, Prabhupada would go, on Sundays, he would take us to the park, and we would carry the rug, and Prabhupada would sit under a tree and have the kirtan. But it was Prabhupada having the kirtan. Nobody ever thought, well, we'll go ourselves. I mean, because everything was done by Prabhupada. But then when Prabhupada wasn't there, but of course we only had the kirtans in the storefront or in the park. And it's hard to believe, but I mean, we were kind of shy and reluctant to, at the same time, just to do what we were doing at that time was very far out, and people didn't know what to think of it, and we were feeling self-conscious. And so I remember one night we were having kirtan in the storefront, and it was very hot. It was summer in New York. And finally, it was just too hot to be in there. And someone said, well, let's go outside. And so we just went outside and started having kirtan. And immediately, because when we had kirtan in the shop, some people would stop by and look in and scratch their head and, walk by. And, they thought this was nuts. And then mostly the people who just came in were the drunks, the Bowery bums. They would kind of lurch in, and I would then lurch them back out. And but that was the only interest. Only young hippie kids would actually walk in. So we went outside and just on the street corner. But I'll never forget that first kirtan. It was outside. I was thinking, if we chant loud enough, maybe Prabhupada, he's in India, maybe he'll hear it. And somehow we'll just call out and connect. So everyone was chanting very enthusiastically, kirtan and playing. We had the tom-tom and playing the drum, and then this huge crowd formed. Everyone stopped. And this huge crowd, hundreds of people. And then somebody just, we used to pass around at the end of the kirtan a collection ball, but that was in the temple. So someone put the collection ball on the sidewalk, and people just started throwing money, pitching money in. And that was the first actual kirtan. It just happened like that. And then we realized that, hey, this is a way of spreading, also getting support, but also some people were chanting, and we had flyers. They would take flyers. We had no books. So it just happened like that. And then I wrote Prabhupada a letter in India saying how this is what happened. Prabhupada said, oh, very good. You continue this, expand it, and like that, Prabhupada. Prabhupada always guided, but always from behind.
Speaking of introduction, the first street Sankirtan happened, it happened maybe in New York first, but it happened to us on Lord Chaitanya's appearance day. We were told to go to the temple and chant kirtan, chant on our beats, and read whatever we had, and to alternate those. So after about 3-4 hours, myself, Jayananda, Jivananda, and I think Uddhava just looked at each other and communicated non-verbally, and we went like that, and let's take this outside. And so we continued. We chanted in the street. We went around the corner to Willard Street, in the place that we first lived there before Prabhupada did, and we gave it to him. And we went to the window and we were chanting, and Prabhupada comes to the window and he goes like this. So we go, oh no, he's telling us to go away, and so we're going back to the temple. We thought it was a great idea chanting outside. So we're going back, so Upender comes storming out. He runs out, he says, no, that's the Indian way of saying come here, come here. So we went upstairs and Prabhupada said, Krishna has given you the intelligence to chant in the street. Now I want you to do this every day. And so Street Sankirtan, Harinama started as of that day.
His level of compassion was just amazing. While we were beginning to think that only important service was important, while we were thinking that only big devotees were big, that monkeys were good for building roads to Lanka, but spiders weren't. Prabhupada was taking a totally different approach, and that approach was based on true compassion. He was taking the position that his natural concern for people was such that I remember one time in 1968 he wrote to Shamadasi. It was before I went out there in New Vrindavan, just after she had married Hayagriva, and it turned out she had had an infection in one of her fingers. And he wrote 5 letters to Shamadasi concerned about her finger. Now, that's not what one had thought in those days. We were thinking, oh, it's just your body, it's just made of stool and worms and blood and pus and all those nice things. Who cares about your body? Chop off the finger, continue to serve Krishna. But no, Prabhupada did it. And in those days, in all the temples, what we do is we Xerox the letters from Prabhupada and distribute them to all the temples. So every temple had a book of Prabhupada letters, probably 100 or 200 letters, and we'd collect them. So when everybody came and new devotees, we'd just say, oh, do you want to hear what a letter from Prabhupada is like? A letter from Prabhupada was sort of like the buzzword for, must be what ants feel like when they get their grain of sugar. A letter from Prabhupada. Anyone's letter from Prabhupada was a letter from Prabhupada. What to speak of one directed to oneself. So I remember I was in the Detroit temple one time. I was sitting going through letters for Prabhupada, just noticing how much compassion he was directing towards one and all.
So as far as I'm concerned, he was expert in all the qualities of a great devotee. Just by seeing him, you think of Krishna. But the one that stuck out for me was compassion. Prabhupada, although very non-compromising at time and very strict, was open-minded, doing what the situation called for. If it meant tying up a microphone with a Brahmin thread, or understanding our foibles. He once said to me, if I don't forgive you, and he usually did, if I don't forgive you, with a compassionate face, he said, then Krishna will forgive you. And if Krishna does not, Radharani will.
In the final days, which was the most poignant, we were there in Vrindavan and having like the vigil, the kirtan, and taking turns chanting softly with the little symbols. And at a certain point, I got sick. I got this fever. I don't know what it was. I just one day just walked back to my room and just collapsed right in my room, and just fever. And so I was sick for a few days, and anyway, it took me about a week or so to recover, and then I was able to, when I got better, then I was able to again go and see Prabhupada. So when I came there, because Prabhupada was just lying on his bed, and he was conversing with his servants, and sometimes he would ask who was having the kirtan, and so that particular day he asked, and they said, they mentioned my name, and then Prabhupada said, oh, Brahmananda, and then he made me come, and then I came forward, and so he said, you were ill, you were not feeling well. I mean, here's Prabhupada, just completely shriveled, and I mean, Prabhupada is not maybe feeling. I mean, when Prabhupada was concerned, I'm not feeling well. I had just a little fever, and here's Prabhupada on his departure bed, and he said, "Oh, you were not." I mean, he with such concern, and really with love, and I just was totally, affected by that. How Prabhupada could be thinking that I wasn't feeling well. So I think this is the thing that affected me most, how much Prabhupada loved us. But the thing is, we're not very lovable. And we all have defects and so on. But why did Prabhupada love us? And he loved us because he saw us as servants of Krishna. And he also even said that we were sent by his Guru Maharaj to help in his mission. But anyway, Prabhupada saw us as Krishna's servants, and his mission was to spread Krishna consciousness. So whatever we could do to assist and do something in this cause of Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada very much appreciated. And I think that's the essence of Srila Prabhupada. At least he could see us as servants of Krishna. So let us just try and be that. That's all. Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Sivasadi Gaur